seyirciler, az önceki panelle ilgili olarak gösterilen ilgi dolayısıyla ve sorular dolayısıyla tahmin ediyorum sizler açısından oldukça verimli geçti. Bizler de bu öğle yemeğinin öncesindeki son panelde insanoğlunun ihtiyacı olan enerjiye ulaşımı için en son engel olarak önünüzde bulunuyoruz. Şimdi müsaadenizle bundan sonraki konuşmalara İngilizce olarak devam etmek istiyorum. Dear participants, I just would like to make a small note since there was a big, kind of interest for the previous panel, and since it is because of the energy, I believe just in front of the last hurdle before the lunch, and the human definitely needs energy. We will try to be brief, and then we will try to present the topic for you to cover almost all perspectives. But before that, I just would like to welcome our panelists, and then here today we have 4 panelists, and they are eminent speakers on the topic, and we have LadyOlga, and we have also Peter Van Bra. I may mispronounce your last name, but please bear with me. And we have Ambassador Tacan İldem, former NATO section, and also we have General Patrick Cordingley, retired Major General. This topic, an important ally in NATO, definitely Türkiye is a very recent and very current topic, and I would like to welcome, first of all, every spectator, and would like to just mention that just over 7 decades, NATO has been the only military and political alliance that has survived and passed through the Cold War period and still in existence. But there are many unknown factors and also different perspectives about the alliance itself and also the relationship among the member states and also that of the member states with NATO as well. Although Turkey joined NATO in 1952, the relationship between Türkiye, and also NATO is very hot topic nowadays to grasp, and there are also many perspectives on this topic. And I think if we just start with some statistics and also some facts about this relationship and also NATO perspective and Turkey, we will set the stage for a better understanding. And the creation of NATO, of course, this is not a history lesson, but was meant to serve for 3 purposes, and that was deter Soviet expansionism after Second World War and prevent revival of national militarism in Europe and also encourage European political integration. And for the very first reason, that is the deterrence of Soviet expansionism, Turkey also joined NATO in 1952. And end of the Cold War, of course, was not the end of this political military alliance, and NATO adopted, as it has always done, and so it has focused more on the crisis response, and then started to expand with the accession of new member states. But this end of Cold War period created a kind of so-called peace dividend. Turkey, unfortunately, did not enjoy that so-called peace dividend and then maintained a huge military because of its geography in the region. And currently, NATO, with its 30 member states and almost 1 billion population, is continuously evolving, and just recently in June adopted a new strategy. So this strategic concept just recognized 2 main threats. One is Russia, and this was bluntly and also openly stated in a communique of the summit, and also terrorism with all its forms and manifestations. Of course, this was not the end of the story, and rising China was also was considered another challenge to NATO, and this was also mentioned in full detail after the summit. And we also have witnessed some cyber and hybrid activities, threats, and so that was also mentioned, and the fragility, instability, insecurity, and also the conflict in Africa, Middle East was also recognized and mentioned and in this new concept. So a lot of references to climate change in the previous panel as well, the climate change, and the food insecurity was also recognized by NATO as some of the challenges in the 21st century. So from the Turkish perspective, Turkey considered itself, starting from the second Cold War period, having the longest land border with Soviet, paid big sacrifices and made those sacrifices in the defense of Euro-Atlantic area. So Turkey also sees, of course, I'm not talking in the name of Turkish Republic here, that is for sure. I'm just presenting my views, but in this visibility of security. So this transatlantic bond link is very dear to Turkish hearts, and would like to maintain that one. And again, looking at the statistics, Turkey is one of the most contributors to the nation, so it's the top 5 contributor to NATO operations, and also among the top 8 contributors to the NATO budget. So, and according to Turkish public, Turkey has always committed to her pledges. So just coming into mind, the Turkey's has provided important radar sites for the ballistic missile defense, and forces declared to NATO, and military operations against radicals and also terrorist organizations. But again, in the Turkish public opinion, there seems to be a perception that NATO's inaction or no action against Turkey's fight against the terrorism is a big issue. So it requires a more steadfast support from NATO in that regard. And so also Turkey expects all allies to recognize PKK, PYD as the terrorist organization. And as we have witnessed in the accession talks of Sweden and Finland. And so Turkey is also the only country that can interact with Russia, as in the cases of grain corridor and energy supply and Armenia-Azerbaijan crisis and Ukraine crisis. So these are very recent that everybody could easily follow in the media. And on the other hand, Turkey is strategically competing with Russia in the fields or in the area in such as Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh and Syria as well. So that also brings some sort of checks against Russia. So also according to again Turkish public opinion, NATO's enlargement, especially the activities in and around Black Sea, has kind of a sword. It has a edge which brings also some sort of escalation. So there's a fine line between deterrence and escalation that needs to be touched upon. These are the points that I have just tried to summarize from the Turkish and NATO perspective. But I think also a quote is well deserved at this time, and I would like to quote to Sir Winston Churchill, and he said, "There's only one thing worse than fighting with the Allies, and that is fighting without them." Without further ado, now I'm going to give the floor to Lady Olga, and then ask her to kind of elaborate on more this type of questions that I can just summarize. The defense and security initiatives of NATO and the balance of stability, and then how it affects the security of Turkey, and balance between Euro-Atlantic security and Turkey's own security, and what does Turkey's security concerns mean to alliance, and what else could be done more to please Turkey in a way that it is addressed, and what additional initiatives are required. And now I'm going to give the floor to Lady Olga Maitland. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lady.
Yeah, it's on.
Is it? Your Excellencies, my good friend Cengiz Bey, if he's not in the room, he knows that my heart is with him. But I come here today as a friend, but I may also be regarded as something of a disruptor in the debate and discussing Turkish role within the NATO alliance. So yes, of course, Turkey is an ally. And also here in 1922, we have to accept something. We are at a crossroads. You could say that while Turkey remains firmly within NATO, a rocky road lies ahead, and the future will be undoubtedly different from now on. Different horizons, different perspectives are emerging both from the US and in Turkey. And indeed, times were very different, as my good friend, the Brigadier General, pointed out. In 1952, following Turkey's accession to NATO, the newly elected leader at the time, Adnan Menderes, expressed the desire for his government to be the military alliance's backbone. And indeed, as the first country to join NATO following its founding in 1947, Turkey was important to all sides. Turkey gave a crucial strategic position between Europe and Asia, and astride both the Middle East and the Black Sea. And it was firmly in the West, sharing democratic values and concerns that we all had about the ascending Soviet Union's expansion in the Cold War. And seeking NATO membership was as much a political move as a military one. And 70 years later, Turkey has changed fundamentally. And so too has the international landscape, as we've been talking over the last 2 days. And for all of us, especially within NATO, we will just have to adapt. And horizons have shifted. And the Soviet Union's new Russia under Putin today has created a new axis. Russia is very close to Turkey, with only Georgia between. So this is important to them both. And the first most evident shift came in 2019, when Turkey took possession of the S-400 surface-to-air missiles from Russia, to be set up and operated by Russians and designed to intercept US F-35s. Well, not surprisingly, NATO reacted. It was bewildered, it was confused, it was angry. And I can understand why. I think we all should. For NATO, Russia is unambiguously in the enemy category, as indeed Lord Robertson pointed out yesterday, following the Ukraine war, which is putting a strain on Turkey's complex relationships, as both countries have developed competitive cooperation through different conflict zones. And for all that, NATO has put on a brave face and continued with a business-as-usual program. Turkey was fulfilling its commitments to defense, yes. For example, at the time, guarding Kabul airport in Afghanistan and doing nothing to hinder a NATO-EU security arrangement, which it could have blocked. And Turkey fully and actively participates in the alliance's exercises and missions and has been supportive in NATO's efforts to help Ukraine repel the Russian invasion. Indeed, Turkey sent drones, mine-resistant vehicles, and indeed has made an allocation of $35 million worth of equipment to Ukrainian armed forces. So they have played their part. And Turkey is an important ally. That is self-evident. But it is true, and I think we have to face up to it. It has been an uncomfortable partner, indifferent to NATO members' concerns, and at moments, and let's be frank, it has seemingly come across as being outright hostile. Now, different agendas, yes. There have been a number of occasions when, as a NATO ally, Turkey aircraft harassed Greek aircraft, menaced Greek naval vessels. Turkey balked at the deployment of a NATO radar system in Turkey and objected to Sweden and Finland joining NATO, and so the list goes on and on. President Erdogan blocks consensus until the last minute when concessions are made, and the latest of that, by agreeing to the admission of Sweden and Finland, Turkey was able to obtain the American F-16s. So in the end, issues are managed and will be managed, but in essence, NATO and Turkey must dethorn their relationship. They're going to have to rethink it. For today, it's evident Turkey has new horizons. It sees a world beyond NATO and a role to be both an active member of the alliance, but also a key player in the Russian axis with its relationship to China and so on, and a significant regional and geopolitical player. And I can understand its reasoning, but let's look at it from a different point of view. From a NATO perspective, there can be positives in this. So I'm not going to be totally negative. Turkey is the only NATO country with a real dialogue and regular contact with President Putin. Others have tried and failed, be it President Macron or even the US president. And as my own Russian source, Valery Morozov, now living in London, points out, we must not underestimate that there is a political rationalization. Ideology is not involved. Best to call it transactional neutrality. And that suits both parties, non-judgmental, political pragmatism. And also, President Putin feels he can talk comfortably to President Erdogan, and no one else can. And this has given President Erdogan an undeniable edge as a moderator in a NATO-Russian relationship, especially over Ukraine. A worthy goal and can be helpful. On the one hand, Turkey has benefited. It has had a free trade agreement with Ukraine, allowing 95% of Ukrainian goods to be imported into Turkey duty-free, more than 10,000 items. And on the other side of the coin is trade with Russia, rapidly increasing. And indeed, during the Ukraine war, the period of trade between Turkey and Russia increased by 198%. And this includes Turkey paying for Russian gas in rubles, the introduction of the Mir payment system. So tourists can return to holiday in Turkey as they used to, a long-standing favorite destination. And let's look at another benefit. There's been an agreement to construct a new Russian atomic power station. So whether the long-term trading future is quite so bright is open to question as Russia reels under sanctions which take time to bite. So I can understand that Turkey may have to take advantage of when it can. But is it so negative for NATO to accept that Turkey has pursued a balanced approach to Ukraine and Moscow since the war began? In recent months, they speak by phone. They have had at least 3 one-on-one meetings, and that dialogue has given President Erdogan the means to broker an agreement, which was mentioned earlier on, with the United Nations to open the Black Sea waters in Ukraine to export grain to desperate African countries. And that grain deal has been acknowledged has averted a global food crisis. But meanwhile, this new relationship with Turkey has enabled Russia to bypass Western sanctions via Turkey. And I must say, in private, in conversations I've had on the margins of this conference, I've been hearing a number of examples. So where does NATO go from here? My learned friend, Sir David Logan, former ambassador to Turkey, gave a lecture last week to Cambridge University. And in his remarks, he referred to the renewed commitment of the United States to Europe and the change in German defense policy. Moreover, the accession of Finland and NATO and Sweden to NATO are very important indeed. But the current crisis, he pointed out, will end. There is always going to be an ending. But on the other hand, the American commitment to Europe will not last forever in its present form. And the Asia-Pacific region and the threat posed by China will matter more to the United States. So in the long term, the prosperous Europeans will have to learn to look after themselves. But where does Ukraine fit into this picture? Well, it should not join NATO, that's been agreed. But it has been agreed also that Ukraine will not stand alone. They can depend on Europe for support when they need it, not to be left at the mercy of the Russians again. But finally, we do need a new Western security architecture to take account of shifting geopolitical tectonics in which the Ukraine war has been a major factor. Remember the pressure mounted by President Trump, admittedly in a rather rude and tactless manner, for Europe to take more responsibility for its own defense, and it should. And the fact is that after 77 years of peace, Europe has devoted its energies to social support at the expense of defense, and the US, meanwhile, is looking east and wants to devote its defense energy and strategy to countering China. Would it really rescue Estonia in the face of Russian aggression, despite Article 5, which, by the way, it invoked over the Afghanistan? Changing old habits on 9/11. Changing old habits will be difficult politically and economically. President Macron has seen the writing on the wall. His recent idea of a European political union shows that this is a time for new ideas. Europe needs a new, pragmatic relationship and approach to foreign policy. And I very much hope that Turkey would see to own participation in this wholeheartedly and in full spirit. After all, Turkey has always had a respect for former enemies and partners. And as we mark the anniversary of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's death yesterday, I remember vividly a visit I made to Gallipoli for the annual commemoration for the conclusion of the First World War. And thousands of British, New Zealanders, Australians died alongside young Turks. And I recall the sincere and touching tribute that President Atatürk made. And in it he said, and I quote, "Those heroes that shed their blood on our land and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. You may rest here in peace, side by side with our Mehmets. You, the mothers who sent their sons from the country far away, wipe your tears. Your sons are now in our bosom, and they are in peace. And they sleep in tranquility. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. So be it. We are indeed all one together." Thank you.
Thank you, Lady Olga. And as you referred to Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and then since they have become our sons, and we know that there may be some different perspectives among the siblings as well. So we have also just heard those different perspectives. Thank you for that. And I have also noticed that Mr. Ambassador Tacan İldem took some note. Maybe he may bring some his perspective, not just to counter, of course, but because there's a long list of activities that Lady Olga mentioned, and I think you have some more words to say on that. The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, my greetings to all the distinguished participants, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure for me to be here today. I would like to thank the International Cooperation Platform for inviting me to speak on this panel with very eminent panelists. I have listened to Lady Olga very carefully. Of course, I'm not representing the Turkish government. The beauty of being retired ambassador is that you speak out your own mind and heart. Therefore, I will be doing so. But before addressing some of the issues that she raised, perhaps just in a nutshell, I would like to recall how the geopolitical setting has changed with the dramatic turn of events, with the illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea in 2014, but the hot war to happen in 2022. And I would like to make a reference to NATO's new strategic concept, which was adopted in Madrid at the summit meeting this year, to succeed the previous strategic concept of 2010. And at that strategic concept, the definition of the geopolitical setting was much different. We were talking about peace in Europe, Russia to be a strategic partner, but what we have seen in 2022 was that war was unfortunately back in the continent. Now, I have been participating in many international meetings in different countries, many of them in allied nations, capitals or cities, and there is a developed rhetoric, almost a talking points, enumerating some of the arguments that Lady Olga made in any speech that you can hear, sometimes more critical, sometimes less critical, but the common denominator is to be critical against Turkey, an allied country within NATO. And I have to emphasize the fact that within NATO, there has always been differences of opinion. It is thanks to the very nature of NATO, not being like the former Warsaw Pact, by the dictation of one country to impose upon others what they have to say, what they have to believe. So since Suez Canal crisis of 1956, NATO has always encountered difficult moments. I have to remind you of what President Macron said in October 2019 by referring to NATO as brain dead. Why did he do so? Because of the fact that the United States at that time made a unilateral decision to withdraw its forces from Syria and for Turkey to launch a cross-border operation to Syria. And he thought that France, having territorial claims, historical claims on a question very dear to France's heart, Syria, he thought that his country was left out of the picture, and it was not consulted. Well, the very interesting fact that perhaps he should have been reminded of that, France has always been objecting for discussions to take place within NATO on certain geographies, including Syria. So if France is now aligned with the idea that NATO will be a unique and essential forum of transatlantic consultations, it's a welcome development. I hope from now on, NATO will be used more for such consultations. Now, in such international discussions, the criticism towards Turkey is mainly whether Turkey is shifting axis, whether having a rapprochement to Russia to the expense of its commitments to NATO. And I'm not going to advertise my article, which is published 2 days ago on European Leadership Network website. You may, if you want, to refer to it. But I specifically dealt with this question. And I tried to give some insights historically how Turkey's engagement with Russia had been. Well, during the imperial past of both Russia and the Ottoman Empire, we had so many wars against each other. Maybe the most that we fought against had been Russia. In the Soviet Union, and you referred to that, LadyOlga, it was the territorial demands of Russia. It was during Stalin period over Turkish Straits and eastern provinces of Turkey, which led Turkey for the search of having its security in the alliance. It was not only that, it was also the very strategic vision of Turkey to join the Western democracies, family of nations in the West. That's why we became the co-founder of the Council of Europe in 1949. Now, why Turkey is engaging with Russia? Well, when you look at the map, all the crisis areas surrounding Turkey, from Nagorno-Karabakh to Syria, Libya, they are in our vicinity. And Russia is the most important and sometimes the only actor in those conflict areas that we need to engage with. In order, in the simplest terms, to deconflict what we both would be doing on the ground. But something is missing in the evaluations in the West, that on almost every crisis areas, we are in the opposing sides. This is missing in the evaluations. Of course, we need to talk with Russia. Of course, President Erdogan has to talk with Putin. And to the envy of some in the West, again, I will refer to President Macron, whom I have nothing against, but he also said that NATO should be one country to talk with. It was at a conference to the ambassadors, French ambassadors, annual conference. And he said, if we don't do that, Erdogan will be the only one to talk with Putin. So this is, in a way, interesting how there is also a genuine desire on different capitals to engage with Putin. Yes, indeed, Turkey, with all this high-level engagement, has a strategic partnership relationship which flourished in the last 12 years with Ukraine. I mean, encompassing so many areas, including defense industry cooperation. We are providing Bayraktar, but Bayraktar is only one example of Turkish support to Ukraine. There is Kirpi systems. There are modernization efforts of the Ukrainian naval forces by Turkey. And Ukraine is grateful to what Turkey has been doing. Don't forget that when Russia was qualifying, labeling the war as special operations, 3 days after the launching of the operations, the so-called operations, Turkey was the one country as the custodian of the Montreux Convention to invoke relevant articles, first and foremost, Article 19 of the Montreux Convention, to enable warships not to enter to the Black Sea, to make sure that the hot conflict does not spread to Black Sea area. It is an important element to recognize. And I will give you one clear example that when sham referenda were conducted for the 4 regions in Ukraine by the Russian Federation, Turkey came out with a strong statement. Not only the government, but the opposition figures as well, that this would never be recognized. And like Crimea, these 4 regions' annexation will not be recognized by Turkey. This is a solid expression of Turkey's unwavering support to territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine. And one should not forget that, okay, since 2014, NATO has been in a, I should say, strategic transformation to boost its deterrence and defense. I served as NATO Assistant Secretary General during that time. And it is fascinating to see how allies agreed to further this strengthening of deterrence and defense. And you mentioned consensus. Consensus is the, in the core of the functioning of NATO. If Turkey had not agreed with all these measures to have this transformation, how could it be possible? So if we are proud to say that NATO has boosted its deterrence and defense and made such a transformation in military adaptation, it is thanks to Turkey's support as well. This has to be recognized. Now coming to accession of Finland and Sweden, and I recognize the presence of the distinguished ambassador from Finland, my good friend here in the audience. I have worked with Finland and Sweden for so many years during my tenure as NATO Assistant Secretary General, but also when I was Turkish ambassador to NATO. They are 2 very important partners of NATO, and I consider their application to become a member a very strategic decision, knowing the internal dynamics of these 2 countries and the public support. And I must say that their accession to NATO would not only boost their own defense, but make an enormous contribution to defense and security of the alliance as a whole, including Turkey. So I hope that this trilateral mechanism, based on the memorandum that 3 countries agreed upon, will yield concrete results to address the legitimate security concerns of Turkey, being fight against terrorism, which is also defined as one of the 2 main threats that NATO faces. It is a direct and asymmetric threat to the citizens of NATO countries, but also international peace and stability. Now, one word on terrorism. It is true that we are not eye to eye with all individual allied countries. And the United States, a very important ally of Turkey and which has a prominent place within NATO, unfortunately continues to extend its support to YPG-PYD which was recognized in the past to be the extension of PKK. But the explanation given by the US administration at the time was that this engagement with PYD-YPG was necessary in fight against Daesh, ISIS. And they said this is temporary, tactical, and transactional. Well, I don't know. I mean, for so long, this support has been going. What kind of temporary nature we can talk about? What kind of tactical thing we can talk about when strategic concept defines terrorism is one of the main threats? Then the credibility of NATO would be tarnished, and we should not allow that. My personal plea has always been to the United States for it to start engaging properly. In English, there is an expression, to talk Turkey, to talk seriously with the Turkish side in addressing all these issues, including S-400s that Lady Olga referred to. Personally, I never agreed with the decision of the government to acquire this system because it is not fitting to the ecosystem that Turkey's arsenal has with interoperability issues. But I would also like to refer to the statements of the Secretary General when this issue first came out. He said, this is the sovereign decision of each individual allied country, which system to acquire, at the same time referring to interoperability issue. Now, I cannot agree with you, Lady Olga, when you said to purchase S-400s in order to target F-35s. This is the argumentation of the lobbies working in Washington. When I was in Washington, D.C. in 2019, my colleagues were urging me and alerting me that all the lobbies working against Turkey were in fact advocating that S-400 acquisition would be detrimental for operations conducted by F-35s. So in a way, a mistake committed by the Turkish side because of the resource issues was exploited as a pretext for all the argumentations that you said. The last thing I could say is that when there are differences, it would be essential for allies to talk to each other. Not through megaphone diplomacy, but behind the closed doors. Right now, there is no appetite in Washington to engage with the present Turkish administration. There are technical level discussions, but what I mean with serious engagement is more than that. And there is a wait-and-see policy, perhaps looking at the upcoming elections in Turkey, but they have to understand that whichever government will be in power, there are certain policies which will not change. Engagement with Russia will remain. Commitment to NATO will remain. Our sensitivities regarding to fight against terrorism will remain because it is not something related to party politics. It is a bipartisan approach of all Turks. So these are perhaps the initial comments that I could make. But in any case, being a believer, true believer of NATO, the deterrence, defense, and security it provides, I have to say that Turkey has been and will be a committed ally of this great alliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador İldem, and your initial comments and extended a bit longer, not because of the national favoritism from my side, but I think it's quite hot the topic itself required more time. And so in order to be fair to all the speakers, I will also allocate extra time if the speakers would like to use. And with that, I guess, because of their references to United States, and we have a guest from North America, Mr. Peter Wambra. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to be in Türkiye. I used to live here when it was called Turkey. And my son was born in Ankara, and now he's 18 years old. And it's a privilege to be back in this beautiful country and in this beautiful city. I'm just going to cut to the chase. Well, before I do, let me say this. Today is November 11th. And what that is called in the United States is Veterans Day. In Canada, it's Remembrance Day. In Europe, it is November 11th. Remembrance Sunday is on Sunday. And it's an opportunity for those who fought on what we call the Allied side in the War of 1914-1918, World War I, the Great War, to reflect on the causes of the war, the sacrifices made during the war. As LadyOlga said and quoted Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, Turkey was on the other side of that war. And yet, just like Germany and the UK, or the United States and the UK, or the United States and Canada, Turkey and the UK, the United States, Canada, France are the closest of partners. And to cut to the chase, and I think this is an important point, NATO is stronger with Turkey in it, and the rest are details. And we will, of course, are discussing those details. But it is also important here in Istanbul to acknowledge that Turkey is stronger for being in NATO. And these two truths are fundamental to the conversation that we are having today. I'll now quote one of my favorite presidents, President John F. Kennedy, who said a lot of good things. One of the things he said is, where you stand depends on where you sit. And simply put, Türkiye sits in a very, very different region of the world than Canada, the United States, the UK, and most of Europe. And so the worldview that comes from here is simply different. And I think in many capitals, including the United States, certainly including Paris, there is a frustration that Turkey doesn't just get in line and view the world exactly the same way that the world is viewed either on the other side of the Atlantic or from Western Europe. And let's be clear, Turkey is Turkey. Türkiye is Türkiye. It is not going to stop being Türkiye. The same way the United States is not going to stop being the United States. And guess what? There are plenty of frustrations being America's partner and ally as well. I hear them all the time. There are frustrations. I work in Washington, D.C. Every ally, not just Türkiye, has plenty of frustrations with the United States of America. And that is just fine. That's not to say that what LadyOlga said is not true. Everything she said is true. Everything Ambassador said is true. But all of these truths can coexist. I am going to go back, if it's okay, to a couple points. Number one is, Taner, as you said, fundamental reasons for NATO to exist in the first place after World War II, and that was simply to keep Russia out, to keep America in, and to keep Germany down. And that was the reason for NATO right up until the fall of the Berlin Wall. And since then, we have to be honest, NATO has been trying to figure out what NATO means, because the reason it was created, it worked. NATO won. And yet we saw soon after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union that NATO continued to be relevant. It was relevant in the Balkans, it was relevant in Afghanistan, and it is certainly relevant now after Putin's war in Ukraine. Let's go back a little bit and talk about the period after 9/11 and NATO's role and Turkey's role. And just to say that in Türkiye's point of view, it is doing its job as an ally. When the United States of America wanted to move troops through Türkiye into Iraq, the Turkish parliament, this was right after brand new government arrived in 2002, the Erdogan government. The Turkish parliament, the Turkish government said no. And the United States was hell-bent on invading Iraq. And the Turkish reaction to that was to warn the United States, just as a few other NATO allies did, and to say that Pandora's box was going to be opened, and that once it was going to be very difficult to control what came next. Well, we know what came next. The U.S.-led invasion of Iraq was perhaps the worst decision, the international decision that the United States ever made. And the United States and the world are still reeling from the decisions that were made. We can fast forward all the way to late summer 2021, when the United States led the evacuation of Afghanistan. And in that period of time, 20-year period of time, there are a lot of mistakes that were made by everybody, from the United States, partners in Europe, and mistakes even in this country as well. What's happened now, as the ambassador said, starting in 2014, but more specifically, February 24th, 2022, is that Russia, by all accounts, nobody serious is saying anything different, is the aggressor in an unnecessary war that is killing thousands of innocent people, displacing millions of innocent people. And when the invasion began, there was an assumption that it was going to be quick and that Russia was going to be able to build a land bridge, knock out the government, and there would be a stronger Russia on Europe's border. Now, had that happened, we don't know exactly what would have happened, but my guess is that NATO would have been divided, the EU would have been divided, Putin would have seemed much stronger, and the evidence we have to that is that the German president, what's his name? No, not Schultz, not the chancellor. Steinmeier actually wrote to Zelensky, and I hate to say it, Macron wrote to Zelensky and told him not to fight. Now, is that is that the message from a NATO leader? No, it's ridiculous. It's abysmal. And Zelensky fought. The Ukrainian people got ready. They fought. They defended Ukraine, and they pushed back the Russian aggressor. And it is that reason that NATO is unified. NATO is not unified because Putin invaded. NATO is unified because Ukraine defended. And that is what gave NATO a backbone. That is what has unified Europe. And that is what is giving NATO, and frankly, a new life at this juncture. And so everybody needs to be very grateful to the Ukrainian people, the sacrifices they are making, and to President Zelensky's leadership. Now, within NATO, as we've talked about, LadyOlga mentioned it, Ambassador mentioned it, a number of Western European leaders have tried to talk to Mr. Putin, and frankly, they have embarrassed themselves. President Erdogan, some of us like it, some of us don't like it, has not embarrassed himself. He has held meetings. He has he kept Putin waiting for a full minute at one juncture, and he has negotiated a grain deal that has probably saved thousands of lives on the African continent. There are commentators in the United States, conservatives, who went from literally 6 months ago saying that Erdogan's Türkiye should be thrown out of NATO, now saying that President Erdogan should win the Nobel Peace Prize. And so I have a few notes. I want to make sure I've said everything. I just took notes from your speech, LadyOlga. So what President Zelensky has done, and what President Erdogan is doing, is creating an opportunity, frankly, for a new NATO to see where we are. It does not mean that everybody in NATO needs to be walking in lockstep with the United States. It means that everybody in NATO has to stay true to the mission, and we have in NATO a country that everybody in NATO should be learning to appreciate and how to work with, while Türkiye continues to benefit from being part of the most important military alliance in the history of the world. Let me just finally say this. I won't take up all my time because I love questions. I'm not allowed to say this anymore, but I'm in Turkey. I can't say it in North America. NATO is the good guys club. That's just what it is. It is the good guys club. And Turkey is in that club. Turkey is a member of the good guys club. And having a member on the eastern flank who can talk to the bad guys is very, very useful to NATO and NATO's mission in the world. And frankly, the rest are details. Details are important, but the rest are details. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. And in reference to what you said about the decision to invade Iraq in 2003, and I guess here among ourselves we have someone who can talk more on the subject, because he took part in the first round of the invasion of Iraq in the first Gulf War. And also, please, the floor is yours for your views about what Peter said as well. A lot of frustrations. Let's see whether they have or not.
I will be brief. I just go back, if I may, to the Korean War, just to remind you that the Turkish army lost as many as the British Army had. I joined the British Army in 1963 before most of you in the back row, not necessarily the front, were born. And at that stage, the British Army was about 250,000 men strong. That means that we had the sort of feel about the way the Turkish army feels about itself now. I know the Turkish army, the regular Turkish army, is bigger, but we still had the feel of what a big army felt like. I regret to tell you, and you probably already know, the British Army now is about 70,000, and how we have the right to dictate anything to anybody any longer, I don't know. It's deeply embarrassing. We need a bigger armed forces. If I could just take you back to 1966, when I was a young officer in the United Nations, and we were in Cyprus. And I remember well, almost day after day, going up to the northern part of Cyprus and drinking coffee with Turkish Cypriots and playing backgammon. I find it deeply distressing now. We had yesterday a plea about Cyprus. I joined that plea. They were wonderful people, and I remember those backgammon games and their coffee, very strong coffee indeed, with enormous, enormous affection. I want now to go to the middle of the 80s, at a time when the West decided it was going to be unhelpful to Turkey over supply of modern equipment. To be honest, I think you, Turkey, were very lucky. It was a silver lining. Look at what you've got now, because you've had to devise a way of producing your own military equipment. I can tell you that your latest tank, for those of you who are interested in tanks, as I am, the Alte, is a magnificent tank. It's a little bit heavy, but is very, very effective indeed. You will make it complete to yourself in time. I'm told at the moment that the engine is coming from South Korea. We've heard somebody mention today your drones. They are magnificent drones and helping Ukraine enormously. Probably the best drones in the world. Expensive, but very, very good indeed. Could you be here self-sufficient for your military equipment by 2035? It's quite possible. I'm told, too, that you are the greatest, 14th largest arms exporter at the moment. I'm rather embarrassed to say that Great Britain is about 4th. I feel that's slightly embarrassing, exporting arms. But you in Turkey have a vision to be a much greater arms exporter. So you will become very efficient in your own equipment. And if I may refer now, from a soldier's point of view, to the S-40 that we've heard mentioned twice already this morning, if not 3 times. From a soldier's point of view, because America was refusing to give you the Patriot missiles you wanted for our defense, you did the logical thing and bought the S-400 from Russia. Totally understandable from a soldier's point of view. Now, if I could go back to the first Gulf War, which I was involved in, I was immensely lucky afterwards to be sent to Oman to become the military advisor to the Sultan Qaboos, the most wonderful man. And he said to me, one thing I want you to do is to get out into the Gulf region, mainly the GCC, and tell me, at the end of when you've been all around, what the decision-making abilities of the armed forces are in the GCC, which are different to the decision-making that we make or that you make in the Western world. This took me quite some time, and it was extremely interesting. And there were some deductions. The first deduction I made was that we in the West were incredibly arrogant. And the second deduction I made was that culture, and religion in particular, played an enormous part in decision-making as far as armed forces were concerned. I'm going to give you 2 examples of exactly what I'm talking about, one humorous and the other one deeply serious. The humorous one, at another conference like this, IDEX, a great arms exhibition, I was asked with a General Chuck Horner, who commanded the coalition air forces in the first Gulf War, to give a talk after lunch to the whole of this audience at IDEX, the great arms exhibition. about 500 people. I would say that the food here is just fractionally better than the food was there. And it ran late, as these things tend to do. And we were asked by the organizer to get up and speak during lunch. It was fine. General Chuck got up first, and I got up. He was speaking for about 2 minutes when the Egyptian delegation arrived. And the host table got up to greet them, and so did the rest of the conference. I turned to the organizer and said, "What do you want me to do?" And he said, "I would keep going if I was you. Nobody's listening to you anyway." Now, the point I make here, this is a cultural point. I was moderately offended at the time, just moderately offended. But then I realized there was a huge difference in the way I'd expected the thing to happen there and then, and what was expected in that GCC meeting. And now I understand that because of the study I did. But the second, rather more serious comment I want to make, I was an expert witness at the massacre at Srebrenica. Deeply unpleasant thing to have to do, and I was involved in the trial of 4 Serbian generals who were responsible for that massacre. And what I realized afterwards is the way in the West we looked at it, and the way here you looked at it was very different because of your culture and because of the religious aspect. In the West, we were absolutely livid that the United Nations had not stopped the most unpleasant massacre in modern European history. Appalling situation. In this part of the world, you could not believe that Muslims could be treated in this way. 2 different ways of looking at the same problem, but very, very important in the way we make our decision-making. We must understand each other, and the West must not be arrogant. 1990, at the end of the Gulf War, and when the Soviet Union had collapsed, there was a great opportunity to grasp the situation in the world and work out where we went. We missed that opportunity. The United Nations could have worked out how it was going to react in the future. We missed that opportunity. And as has already been said, in 2003, during the Second Gulf War, we, the West, released energies we could not comprehend or control. We transformed the region. And I say we, I'm talking about an American-led attack on the Middle East, or particularly on Iraq, which we in Britain were complicit with. We joined in. Some wag produced this advertisement: a nation to serve as a go-between for the Western world and the Middle East and assist in turning suspicion into cooperation, must be a firm ally of the West, Islamic in religion and culture, capable of serving as a role model of secularized Western democracy for other Muslim states. There only was one. It was Turkey. It was already there. And of course, Turkey, as a result of what happened in 2003, had so many problems that the military, the Turkish military, were asked to get involved in. Iran, Iraq, the Balkans, Al-Qaeda, the Arab Spring, and then Libya. Libya, to me, was a disaster. And 9,700 airstrikes, a third of them against civilian populations. And the tragedy was that the arms, of which there were vast quantities in Libya, came through to Syria to go to the Free Syrian Army, who in turn were working with al-Nusra. So you ended up with a complete muddle here, none of which was in the least bit helpful to Turkey. All those situations had to be resolved. And we've heard about the PKK and those situations that existed, which were made worse by our attack on Libya, let alone the extraordinary number of refugees that flooded into the Western world. And then Afghanistan. We mustn't forget that twice Turkey led the assistance force in Afghanistan. Twice you commanded it. And then also, too, at the same time, you retook more land than anybody else from ISIS. And then you get to Kabul airport. I had a nephew who was one of the youngest generals in the British Army, who curiously was working with the American Special Forces, who was sent to work with the Turkish army at Kabul airport as the disaster arose. And That was an extremely difficult situation because you had agreed, the Turkish army had agreed to secure the airport, but not to defend it. In military terms, that's very different. And the Turkish army knew that. They were in a cleft stick, but they stuck there and worked miracles to try and secure the airport at the time, which happened. And this is an arrogant comment. My nephew said they were extremely effective. So you've got all sorts of things that the Turkish army is now involved in, which we are very grateful for. Libya, Qatar, I hope they have lovely fun watching the World Football Organization. Forward operation bases, many more than anybody else in NATO. The ability to talk, as we've heard, to Russia, China, and Iran. And then we still make ridiculous mistakes in the West, knowing how much you are trying to help NATO. Returning to the S-400 issue, we throw in the West, Armenia. What a mistake to do at that particular stage. And I quote from a US ambassador here some time ago, if the Biden administration, so concerned about reestablishing American global leadership, wants to confront the threats from around the world, it cannot succeed without Turkey. And as a really old general, I would say to you, nor can NATO. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Patrick, and you made several points, I guess, which deserves maybe some questions. And even at the expense of this lunchtime, I would like to attempt to take some questions, but would like to limit it probably 10 minutes, and if there are any, of course, and then we will conclude our panel session. Is there any questions?
Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Herkese selamlar. İsmim Malih Çermuk, Rusya'dan geliyorum, katılıyorum.
Biraz yüksek sesle.
Özellikle bugünkü katılıma destek olduğunuz için çok teşekkür ederiz. Çok güzel konuşmalar oldu. Sayın Paşam Patrick Bey'i de özellikle tebrik ederim. Çok içten bir konuşma yaptı. Özellikle bu konuda ondan da bir hakiki bir cevap almak istiyorum. Amerika Birleşmiş Devletleri neden son zaman Rusya'yla evet Ukrayna üzerinden savaşıyorsa ama bugün Yunanistan'daki olan sınırda daha çok adaları silahlandırıyor. Yani bunu Amerika Birleşmiş Devletleri sanki Rusya'ya karşı Yunanistan'ı savunuyor. Siz inanıyor musunuz? Bugün Türkiye ile Yunanistan arasında yeni bir savaş bölgesi açmak istiyorlar. Bu konuda sizin fikrinizi duymak istiyorum. Sağ olun.
The question is directed to Patrick, right?
Yes.
Or Peter?
Sorry.
No. There is no larger agenda on the side of the United States, NATO, the EU, in the skirmishes that are going on in the Aegean. This is a lot of this is politics. A lot of this is, frankly, Greek insecurity. A lot of it is Turkish needing to demonstrate that it won't surrender rhetorically. But I don't follow this. I don't follow this issue minutely, detail by detail. But a lot of things would have to go very, very wrong for there to be a kinetic conflict between Greece and Turkey. It's not something that anybody in Europe or the United States wants.
Okay, Ambassador İldem.
Well, this is an important question, and thank you for this. I think that if there is going to be a hot conflict between the two countries, two allied countries, and with the support of another ally, that will be the end of NATO. We have to be very realistic on that. And I don't give too much credit to such support being made available from the United States for this purpose. But I can also anticipate a situation in which the Greeks are exploiting it for their domestic purposes, because there is a strong historical opposition to the United States and NATO in that country. And I'm sure that they are using it as if it is a support that they are getting from the United States for the purpose of any potential conflict between Turkey and Greece. It is, in their terms, understandable. But we have to understand one point clear. There are bilateral issues, mostly pertaining to the Aegean Sea between the two countries, that need to be resolved through dialogue or using the conflict resolution mechanisms offered by the United Nations Charter's Article 33, peaceful means of resolving issues. The problem is that Greece is not accepting any issue to exist except the continental shelf issue. And they say, we have nothing to discuss with Turkey. It has to be referred to the International Court of Justice. Well, Lady Olga referred to Turkish harassments. Well, I cannot accept this because we are talking about ICAO regulations. And I think it is Article 3 of the ICAO Convention which states that the breadth of the airspace should be exactly the same of territorial waters. How can you explain when Greece has territorial water limit of 6 miles, where the airspace limit is 10 miles? Whenever Turkey flies its aircraft between 6 to 10 miles, Greece considers it to be harassment or violation of airspace, which is ridiculous. The United States is not recognizing this 6 to 10 miles limit to be Greek airspace. It considers it to be international airspace. And lately we know that S-300s by Greece radars locked the Turkish F-16s accompanying US B-52 air fighters during an exercise. So who is harassing whom should be determined with a careful examination. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador İldem, and cognizant of the time restraint that we have right now, we have 2 more questions, but I think after the break you may have some time to ask personally, because really we are under this time pressure. We are not going to take any more questions because we have another panel session which is about the defense industry, which was alluded to, so in that session as well it can be easily discussed. And thank you for your contributions. Then I will end this panel session.
Taner Bey, thank you very much, and to your guests as well. Like Taner Bey said, we're going to break for lunch right now. 20 past 2 sharp, we will start our next session dealing with Western Balkan countries and their EU candidacy. Enjoy your lunch. We'll see you back here at 20 past sharp. Thank you.